皆様、こんにちは。国際交流基金理事長の梅本和義でございます。本日は、ミレヤ・ソリス先生の新著、Japan's Quiet Leadership, Reshaping the Indo-Pacific、ここにございますが、の出版記念講演会にお越しいただきまして、誠にありがとうございます。主催者を代表いたしまして、一言ご挨拶を申し上げます。ソリス先生、ご著書の出版、誠におめでとうございます。ソリス先生はこの本の中で、1990年代以降、日本がいわゆる失われた30年と呼ばれ、外から見ると、中から見てもそうかもしれませんが、長く停滞した状況にあると思われる中、実際には水面下で内政外交面において変化を遂げて、いかにインド太平洋地域において静かなリーダーシップを取るに至ったのかということを事実、データの深い分析に基づきながら、その軌跡を描き出されておられます。そこでソリス博士がキーワードとして使っておられますのが、日本のネットワークパワーという言葉です。詳しくは本日のお話の中でも、またお聞きできるのかと思いますが、急速に変化する国際環境の中で、日本が静かなリーダーシップを発揮する上で、地政学的に重要なアクターをつなぐ幅広いネットワークを構築していく力があるというふうに分析をされております。私ども国際交流基金でも、ネットワークの強化、人的なネットワークの強化ということを重視してきておりまして、また今後ともさらに重視をしていきたいというふうに思っております。本年度、新たにインド太平洋パートナーシッププログラムというものを立ち上げて、もうすぐ第1期の方の選考が行われることになっておりますが、これまでは日米とかですね、あるいは日中という、割合2国間の対話、あるいはネットワークということのプログラムが多かったんですが、私どもとしてはですね、インド太平洋地域の重要性にも考えまして、そこでマルチのいろんな方向のですね、ネットワークの構築に資すようなプロジェクトをやりたいということで、新たに始めることとしたわけでございます。インド太平洋地域を中心とする国際社会における知的ネットワーク、プラットフォームの構築に貢献をしたいというふうに思っております。これからまたいろいろな関係者の皆様のご協力も得ながらですね、このプログラムを発展させて、大きな成果が上がるようにしたいと思っておりますので、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。で、本日は、ソリス博士のご講演に続きまして、船橋洋一先生、鈴木一人先生をお迎えし、お三方による定談を予定をしております。船橋先生、鈴木先生はご紹介するまでもなく、ジャーナリストとして、また研究者として、外泊な知識と深い洞察を持って、国際関係分野の第一線で活躍をされている方でいらっしゃいます。ソリス先生とは、古くからのご友人というふうなことで、ご多忙を極める中、私どものお願いにもう快く応じていただきまして、今日は本当にこのお三方の定談が聞けるということで、私も主催者の一人なんですが、聴衆の一人とも大変楽しみにしているところでございます。この贅沢な機会をぜひ皆様でお楽しみいただいて、またその知的な興奮、知的ななんていうんですか、エンターテインメントというと言葉は悪いですが、エンターテインメントとして楽しみながら、またいろいろなことを深く考察していく上での一助となれば幸いでございます。ぜひ最後までお楽しみいただけると思います。それでは、ソリス先生、どうぞよろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you in Tokyo, to have these beautiful surroundings. 贅沢なことです。And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my new book, Japan's Quiet Leadership. I want to thank the Japan Foundation for the generous grant support that it has provided over the years, including for the research that went into this book. I appreciate very much that President Umemoto is here for the event today. I also want to express my appreciation to Funabashi-san, Chairman of the Global Council of the International House, and Suzuki-san, professor at Todai and director of the Geoeconomics Research Institute, for their intellectual fellowship. We are always willing to exchange ideas with me, to hone arguments, and I think we're going to continue that tradition later today. So I'm looking forward to that. I arrived in Japan a few days ago to participate in the Fujisan Kaigo, organized by Nikkei and JCR, and I've already participated in very substantive exchanges, included with Suzuki-san. And today is a very special occasion for me. There's no greater privilege for an author to be given the opportunity to leave behind the very lonely task of writing and then engage with experts and with a broad audience. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So what I would like to do in my lecture is to tell a little bit about the argument of the book, to tease out some of the main implications, and then I look forward to the conversation with Funabashi-san and Suzuki-san, and certainly with all of you. I would like to hear your comments and your reactions, because that's what it takes for the author to actually come out and get feedback. So let me start with the motivation behind writing the book. What I wanted to do was to do a deep dive on the last 30 years and what has happened in Japan. And I felt that more and more, we were using one frame to talk about Japan during this period, and that is the last decades. And certainly the last 30 years have been a tough period for Japan, many, many challenges, and the book does address them, does not shy away from them. But I felt over time that it had become an overused frame, and therefore that many people were losing sight of some very important developments, both inside Japan and regarding Japan's international role. And I was concerned that by using the frame of the last decades, that the general public might have the idea that these 30 years have been a period of across-the-board stagnation, and therefore that not much was happening in Japan. And I felt that that was increasingly divorced from reality, because this has been a difficult period, but a very consequential period for Japan and for the region. And therefore, I wanted to fight back against this prevailing notion that Japan was immersed in structural decline, with a low growth economy, with dysfunctional politics, and a passive role in international affairs. There's some grain of truth in that, but there's much more, and we need to go beyond that, because one of the things that the book wants to do is to track the many changes, where in the economy, in politics, decision-making dynamics, and certainly regarding Japan's diplomacy. And as I was doing the research for this book, and I was trying to make sense of both of the challenges that Japan continues to face, which are steep, and I'll get into that in more detail as I go along, but also some of the progress that Japan has made, or some of the strengths that don't receive a lot of attention, I came across two main dynamics that I believe are the core messages of the book. So let me start there so I make sure I don't lose you along the way. So the first important dynamic, I think, is that I find that Japan has become more relevant for a larger number of countries, and therefore that there are lessons to be learned from Japan on what to do and what not to do, but that learning from Japan's experience is important. Obviously, we know, of course, about Japan's demographic challenges, and the fact that now scores of countries are going to be facing the same fate. In the beginning, I think that demographic decline in Japan was described as uniquely a Japanese phenomena. And I think it's important to realize that Japan was ahead of the curve, but there are many other countries that are now experiencing this very significant challenge. But there are other areas where Japan's experience is important. For example, one that I think has not received enough attention is how Japan has adjusted to economic globalization. And I'll have more to say on that, but that's certainly something that has shaken many industrialized democracies, and therefore it's important to pay attention as to how Japan has dealt with this challenge. And the other area, I think, where Japan's experience is significant is in how Japan has coped with the rise of China. Because Japan is obviously a frontline state because of geography, and I think there are important lessons here about how Japan has adjusted to this power shift in the region. Now, that, therefore, I think, so one important area that the book wants to cover, but the other one, what I would like to consider is the puzzle, if you will, of the book. The question that I hope elicits people the desire to read the book is that I think there's a very important puzzle. Unquestionably, Japan has suffered some erosion of its relative capabilities, right? Because of the deflationary era, the low growth, because of the demographic challenges, because of the military buildup around Japan. There's no question that, relatively speaking, Japan has suffered this relative decline of capabilities. But what is more interesting is that despite these constraints, I find a more proactive Japan, more proactive diplomacy, not only on the economic field, but also increasingly in the security and political arena, something that we're not used, I think, to see from Japan. So then these are the main messages that the book wants to convey. And then let me tell you how I got here, what is the argument of the book, and then what are some of the implications. So I asked the question, what factors have enabled Japan to play a more proactive role and really be shaping the lines of economic and security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, the regional architecture? Japan has become an important architect of that regional architecture. And to do that, I found that I had to look both at what has changed inside Japan and what has changed around Japan. And this was for me the opportunity to do a deep dive into Japan in areas that I was not as familiar as, I've always looked at Japan from the foreign economic policy point of view, but I felt increasingly we cannot understand any country's international role without looking at what is happening at home. And, therefore, that took me into looking at Japanese politics, immigration policy, adjustment to globalization, and you name it. So I would like to then summarize a lot of material and convey to you two main changes inside Japan, and then I'll talk about what has changed around Japan that has created a strong incentive for Japan to step up. But if I look as to why Japan's doing more, I think it's because Japan has some social and political cohesion that has enabled a more proactive international role. That is, bottom line, if you will, the main message. And there are two elements to this. I think very interestingly, and something that is not discussed enough, it's important to make the point that the populist wave that has produced so much turmoil in industrialized democracies, that has created social and political polarization, that has manifested in a backlash against globalization and an inward turn, that phenomena largely has missed Japan. And, I think that it's not the only reason, but the way in which Japan has adjusted to economic globalization has a lot to do with that situation. And what I find interesting is that it's not that those factors that have fueled what in the book I referred to as the politics of grievance have not affected Japan. Japan has not been in a bubble on its own. It has suffered from these pressures. But nevertheless, I think that the pressures have been managed differently. So what are some of these factors producing this social and political turmoil? Well, certainly the rise of income inequality, and Japan actually has now caught up with the G7 peers, and there is indeed an increase in income inequality, but also integration into the world economy and the turbulence that comes from that. Certainly as some industries, some sectors lose competitiveness, and that has some social and regional consequences. In the United States, there is a very dirty word in politics, and that is outsourcing or offshoring, right? That generates a lot of pushback. That's why the United States, in many ways, has given up on negotiating market access in trade agreements and has lost the mantle of trade leadership. Well, Japan actually has experienced intensely these same forces of offshoring, of integration of China into the world economy. When China joined the WTO and before then, Japan was building a very in-depth economic relation with China and began to import a great amount of goods and components from China. And Japanese companies have been pioneers in the development of global supply chains. So a lot of the industrial base in Japan has also been transferred abroad. So these are trends that in the United States, for example, produce a lot of political heat, but I don't find that same backlash in Japan. And why is that the case? Well, the book tries to explain some of the mechanisms through which Japan has adjusted to globalization. And there are many threads here, and I'm just, being very telegraphic, trying to give you a sense of what the argument is. But I think it's important to understand that the labor outcomes of globalization in Japan have been different. They have been different for a number of reasons. One is that the nature of the trading relationship that Japan established with China is different from the one that the United States has, to the extent that component trade and global supply chain trade is more significant, more important in the Japan-China relation than in the case of the United States and China. I also find that Japan is a country of high employment security and a very robust safety net, and that takes the edge of some of these adjustments to rapid economic change. Now, it doesn't mean that Japan doesn't have challenges of its own when it has to deal with economic globalization or income inequality, certainly. And I do believe, and the book does talk about, for example, the rise of non-regular employment, and in particular, how much female part-time workers are taking the brunt of some of these employment instability. But it hasn't shaken Japan in the way in which has shaken the United States. And this, I think, explains partly why Japan became what nobody, when I was a student, expected Japan ever to be, and that is a champion, a leader of free trade, at a time when the United States has abdicated that role. So that's one very important dynamic, understanding why populism has not taken root here in in Japan, and therefore you don't see the challenges to the institutions of liberal democracy, question the integrity of the electoral process, and all these very negative consequences of sharp political polarization. Japanese democracy has its own set of challenges, and I do address them in the book. I think they're the opposite in many ways of this populist rage that we find in the United States, and they have to do more with apathy or disengagement from the political process. So every country always has its homework to do, but nevertheless, I think that this is a very important dynamic where Japan has some important lessons on how to cope with economic change and facilitate the social adjustment. And the other internal change, I believe, that's significant for a more proactive Japan is that you finally, through the accumulation of administrative and political reforms, and especially the long second Abe administration where you had that political stability, you saw the rise of prime ministerial leadership in Japan. And therefore, it was possible for the first time in a very long time to really challenge some of those vested interests that had kept Japan punching below its weight. And, Japan on international trade had always been passive, playing defensive. The TPP, the road to TPP was tortuous, was difficult. But for the first time, you had the Kante being able to identify national priorities, reconcile different ministries who had competing preferences, and to institute whole of government decision-making structures. And I think this was very clear in how Japan negotiated the TPP, the creation of the TPP headquarters, where you had these elite bureaucrats who came to the headquarters not to represent line ministries, but to represent the interests of Japan in the negotiation table. And let me tell you that created a lot of very pleasant surprises in the United States and other capitals of participating TPP countries, because Japan provided tremendous impetus to the negotiation. And before Japan joined, actually, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether Japan would not be dragging back that initiative, because people were expecting the old Japan, and it was a very different Japan. And on the security policy front, you had the establishment of the National Security Secretariat, and again, the issue of the first national security strategy in almost a decade ago. So these then began to change what was possible in terms of foreign policy initiatives coming from Japan. Now, Japan had a strong incentive to step up, because the neighborhood is becoming more and more dangerous. And I think that it was very clear that Japan needed to do more to safeguard its own interests in this environment. And to again summarize a lot of the material that the book covers, I think that I wonder what you all would think, but my perception, my reading is that strategic thinkers in Tokyo have been concerned about the direction of the great powers. And that applies both to China and the United States. So I think that China has played a very important role in Japan's geopolitical awakening. After decades of investing in developing this economic relationship with China as part of rebuilding relations after the destruction of World War II, I think that Japan has created a very profitable relation with China that is central to its economic prosperity, but more and more it has to deal with the duality of Chinese power, the important economic magnet that China has been, but also increasingly the assertive behavior of China and the challenging of the rules-based order. So I think that there's great worry here about China's military buildup, about China pushing for expansive claims, not only in the Senkaku waters, but also in the South China Sea. And I think that to the extent that China would like to weaken the alliance network in the region or question the role of the United States as security anchor in the region, that creates great concern for Tokyo because the alliance is foundational to Japan's security policy. And I think, therefore, that Japan now has to recalibrate, has been having to recalibrate its China policy. Now, with respect to the United States, it is certainly a good period in the U.S.-Japan alliance, and I think that it has been notable how much the alliance has adjusted to these new realities and expanded the agenda. And I would say that from the point of view of the United States, Japan has become an indispensable ally. When the United States is thinking about its objectives in the region, and that is to remain anchored, remain a resident Pacific power, and addressing the multifaceted China challenge, I think that Japan is the Asian ally that the United States is counting on the most. And we see now how the U.S. and Japan have deepened this alliance, in coordinating with the maritime democracies. The United States very much used the free and open Indo-Pacific as a frame. There are differences in the details of the strategy, but in terms of how you frame the geography of the region or some of the goals for the regional order with the free and open Indo-Pacific, that has become a shared understanding. Now there's more coordination, but this remains a huge challenge on what to do about deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And certainly economic security has become an area where there is now a lot of thought about what to do on supply chain resilience and technology controls. Japan's security reforms, the reinterpretation of the constitution to, when it comes to the right of collective self-defense, the revision to the 3 strategic documents last year, and in particular Japan's decision to do away with this informal 1% ceiling on defense expenditures and to be thinking about what to do in this troubled region, I think that those are all changes that Washington has welcomed. But I would be remiss if I don't mention that, yes, this is an excellent time in the U.S.-Japan alliance, but challenges remain. And the more that the United States and Japan do together, I think the more the coordination task is going to be requiring a lot of effort and investment from both sides. And I think that there's still some significant differences between the United States and Japan on how they're approaching many of these challenges. My sense is that from the point of view of Tokyo, how the U.S. frames its China policy is critical, and they have not always been on the same page. So I believe that maybe a little bit over 10 years ago, there was frustration here that perhaps the United States was not waking up soon enough to the China challenge. But later on, it was like, it's the Goldilocks, right? It went from too much to too little, or the opposite. And when the United States began to frame the approach to China in really just competitive terms, and sometimes it appeared during the Trump years as just purely zero-sum, that also creates risks and apprehension here in Tokyo. And I would also say that there's an area where they're not working together, quite frankly, and that has to do with trade and economic engagement, and that the United States left the Trans-Pacific Partnership is still considered very regrettable. I completely share that assessment. I do believe that this was an own strategic goal on the part of the United States, and I don't see a way back from that. I think that more and more the idea that trade agreements have hurt the American working class has become solidified, and it's very hard to move away from that. But nevertheless, I think that America First economic policies, or not being, or not using the whole tool of economic engagement policies, that is an area where the United States and Japan still need, they're not operating in the same wavelength. So, I think that when you are dealing with, two great powers, they're heading in directions that sometimes create concern, but also the multiplication of challenges in the international sphere, this creates a strong incentive to do more. And then let me then try to get back to the puzzle. And the question here I wanted to answer is, how can Japan do more with less? How is it possible for a declining country in terms of absolute capabilities, it's losing some of them, how could Japan then be more proactive, more influential in shaping the direction of this important Indo-Pacific region? And what I found was a very different foreign policy coming from Japan. Again, as I said before, in the past, Japan was passive on trade and was and downplayed a regional political role. And I find that that's not the way in which I would describe Japan today. And I think that the answer to the puzzle I've been describing to all of you has to do with what I describe as a strategy of connectivity. And I think this is where you begin to see the fruits of very proactive and consistent Japanese diplomacy. And I believe that this materialized first on the economic sphere, which has been traditionally an area where Japan has been more comfortable with economic assistance and other tools, but now increasingly also in the security arena. And I think that the insight here is that Japan has been building very actively networks and partnerships. And I think that in that sense has been ahead of the curve, because now we do see these new unilateralism full-fledged from many countries, and the United States now is also partaking in this. But I think that Japan has been a leader in this front. So let me describe both on the international economic side, but also on the security side, what I see Japan doing. First of all, I would say that Japan remains very much essential to the fabric of the Indo-Pacific economy. And some of this has to do because of the activities of the private sector. Some of it has to do because of the policies of the Japanese government. But certainly through private investment, through the development of global supply chains and regional networks, but also through the supply of infrastructure finance. And Japan has remained very, very important to these countries throughout the region. And I think what's important when it comes to infrastructure finance is that Japan has been able to articulate a different vision from the Belt and Road Initiative as to why it's applying the finance, and the conditions also seem different. And it's doing it, I think, smartly in a way that does not create an either or. You have to choose one or the other, because that would not be very attractive in the region, but certainly providing alternatives to developing countries in Asia seems to be something that has paid off. And let's not forget that Japan, a country that was almost left behind by not negotiating free trade agreements, because it was politically so hard to do that in this country now sits at the center of the most important mega trade agreements that have come into place in the last few years, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the Japan-EU Trade Agreement. Now, I think that Japan has started there, but has gone further, and with a free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, what I think it's new here and important is that I see this as Japan putting forward a blueprint for the regional order, one that is built on certain principles like rule of law, freedom from coercion, freedom of navigation, but where there are tangible benefits, and that's where the connectivity makes a difference, because it's not just rhetoric, but by providing economic assistance, infrastructure, finance, capacity building for maritime safety and so forth, I think this becomes more attractive. And what also has been interesting to watch, and the book does have a table, looking at how Japan has diversified its security relationships by building new types of cooperation with Australia, with India, with the Philippines, and so forth. And that, I think, also is a very, very tangible result of this network diplomacy. In the book, things change, and a lot has changed on the Japan-Korea front. The book, I think what was, to me, noticeable is in this table tracking Japan's security partnerships and the different ways in which these countries can cooperate. The one column that almost came blank was with South Korea. And that now has changed in the past few months in very significant ways, and we can discuss whether this will be institutionalized and this will remain long-term or not, but certainly now there's far more energy going into the Japan-Korea and the trilateral with the United States, and I think this is, if it does remain, this would be a very important unilateral cooperation. Now, having said that, and talked about these network power activities, let me now, I don't want to end with a very sober note, but I do want to end with a realistic note, and to discuss with all of you some of the challenges that I see ahead. Because I think the proposition of being a network power in a fragmenting world is a tricky one. And I think that Japan now has to navigate a harsher environment where many of the foundations of this connectivity strategy are going to be tested. And therefore, there's a lot that remains to be done. So I will identify, I think, three main challenges going forward. And the reason why the rationale for these factors is that all of them in some way undermine or challenge this connectivity approach. The first one is that, well, now that we're all together, we might feel that COVID is way past behind us, but nevertheless, COVID did represent and still represents a challenge. And I think that in particular, I think that Japan managed very well the health, the public health aspect of COVID, and that's reflected in the very low level of mortality and disease. But I think that the Achilles heel of Japan's COVID policy was the protracted border closures. And I think that in particular was very damaging because Japan in 2019 had revised its immigration law to, for the first time, more explicitly accept manual workers because the labor crunch is so severe. And then that was put on hold. And it affected not just, foreign workers, but, academic exchanges, arrival of students. And it's very important, I think, for Japan to be able to, of course, the tourists are back, and we know that very well, but for Japan to recover the ability to be a magnet, to bring more and more students and people who are committed to the study of Japan, and certainly manual workers, and there's a very heated competition for global talent, so skilled workers as well. If Japan is going to really deliver on the digital transformation, it's also going to require, or its plans for industrial policy, it's also going to require a lot of very well-trained engineers, as well as people who will provide a lot of the labor that is essential for all these ambitions. So I think that the way I think of it is that the pandemic sort of is like it brings like mirror to countries, and I think that some of the challenges become more observable. And I think in the United States, the polarization was the way in which the society responded. And I think in Japan, again, the border closures are something that the country still needs to move past, and then become very proactive in restoring this element of people-to-people connectivity. The other element where I think that there's a delicate balancing act that Japan and many others are now confronting is on economic security. And, we are now in a new world, and, Suzuki-san is one of the foremost experts on security, and Funamashi-san, they're all working very, very closely on this because the stakes could not be higher. And what I think we find is that we have a combination of state rivalry, now very out in the open, but also in the middle of a very fast and profound technological change. And it's that confluence of how much the technology landscape is shifting and how much the great powers and others are thinking of international relations from a competitive lens that has transformed the foreign economic policy agenda. So, the era of more benign integration is past us, and I think that there's more concerted effort with how we reduce the vulnerabilities that can be created by international economic interdependence. Many countries are rethinking over dependence on a specific suppliers and a specific nations, but there's a risk here. The risk is that we end up emphasizing the national security angle and then lose sight of the enormous economic welfare that has come from that process of economic integration. So getting it right so that you can diminish the risk of exploitation, of supply chain disruption, of countries using their control over so-called choke points in the supply chain. That's all important, but if we overdo it, then we might end up undermining the open innovation systems. We may also have fewer or less international influence, because I think that one way in which industrialized countries can be very effective in working with the developing world is precisely by offering tangible economic benefits. So again, I think that there is now a balancing act between economic internationalism, and I think that was the all-out economic strategy that Japan pursued, but now this hard-edged economic statecraft, and how you get the balance right between the two is a significant task going forward. And my last element that I would highlight here is that Japan's security policy has changed quite substantively. Its ambitions to provide a vision for the regional order, undertake security and defense reforms, those are very important. But we should not lose sight of the fact that Japan still maintains very, very strict restrictions on the use of force abroad. And therefore, it's hard for a country, in any country, but certainly with this kind of limitation also, to deal with a world that looks more Darwinian, let me put it that way, where the use of force is becoming more rampant. And we've seen the developments in Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Here in the Indo-Pacific, there's tensions in the Korea Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea. And certainly now we're also grasping the consequences of the events in the Middle East. And I think that it's very important for Japan to think through how it will navigate this harsher international environment. Having said that, let me end up with a note about Japan's response to Ukraine, because I do think this is also another moment that has had major impact on how Japan is positioning itself in the internationally. And to me, it's really been striking the profound impact that the Ukraine situation has had. I think not only in terms of how the government is thinking in Tokyo on how Japan should act internationally, but I think in particular about the population and I think that this facilitated, acceptance of the need for Japan to spend more on defense. I think that it helped solidify the notion that countries that do not defend themselves cannot expect help from others. So I think that that has been important. But I also think that in this turbulent world, Japan responded, I think, effectively by expanding its own network. So, Japan EU or Japan NATO ties have become more significant. And I think that, the Prime Minister Kishida's trip to Ukraine was also an important moment in Japanese diplomacy. So I think at the end of the of my presentation, I would say that yes, it is a harsher world, but at the end of the day, no one country can address the challenges to ensure its own prosperity and its own security on its own. And therefore, the insight that network diplomacy is essential to navigate the challenges ahead remains. And I think that that makes Japan's case more relevant for what's to come. Thank you very much.
それでは後半の定談に移りたいと思います。壇上にはお二人の先生方に加わっていただきました。皆様よくご存知のお二方でございますが、お一人は船橋洋一先生でございます。船橋先生は朝日新聞でご活躍された後にですね、2011年にシンクタンク日本再建イニシアティブ、現在のアジアパシフィックイニシアティブを設立されました。2022年7月ですね、昨年度国際文化会館と統合された後は、同会館のグローバルカウンシルチェアマンも務めていらっしゃいます。もう一方は、東京大学公共政策大学院教授の鈴木一人先生でいらっしゃいます。鈴木先生は、2020年7月にですね、新たに設立されたシンクタンク地経学研究所の所長も務めていらっしゃいます。お二方とも国際政治、経済、外交政策課題についてですね、学術界、論壇、メディアにおいて幅広いご活躍をされていることは皆様ご承知の通りです。ミレヤさんとも長く交流を続けていらっしゃると承っております。それでは、後半、ディスカッションに移りたいと思います。こちらの進行は鈴木先生にお願いいたします。よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。I shall supposed to speak in English. So, well, since Mireya understands perfectly Japanese, so I think it's much easier for you to do that in Japanese. But nevertheless, it's been set as an English session, so we'll go with that. Follow that order. This is what people call the rule-based order. So let me just start asking. When we talk about the book, we always start talking about the title. So this book's title, Japan's Quiet Leadership. So why you made it quiet instead of, let's say, sort of undergoing or sort of timid, or there are kind of different adjectives that you can use. But why you chose quiet?
Great. Well, thank you very much, Suzuki-san. And yes, I get that question because what I wanted to convey with that adjective of quiet is that I think that there's a lot happening in Japan that goes under the radar, and it's not understood enough or reported enough. So, for example, the fact that you don't have the deep political polarization in Japan, that's not something that there's going to be a news article about. But I do think that it shapes very much the country's trajectory. Or when you think about the network power idea, a lot of it is really built on diplomacy. And most of it is, diplomacy about being consistent in how you provide infrastructure finance, how you build these security partnerships. Again, that doesn't have the big headlines, but it's meaningful because it builds the fabric of how Japan is shaping the region and having this outreach to many, many countries. So I think that's mostly what I wanted to get at quiet, because again, I become more and more perplexed that a lot of what Japan does is not well understood. For example, there is this survey that the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies publishes, and it's interesting that when you ask experts from these countries, which country you trust the most. Well, which countries shape the geopolitical dynamics or the economic trends in the region? It is the United States and China. Which countries do you trust? Very, very low trust of the United States and China, but Japan actually very high marks. Or which country you think you want to rely on to navigate geopolitical rivalry? Again, Japan comes up. And again, it's something that it's not frequently discussed, but it makes a difference for the country's regional role.
Right. Well, I fully agree that Japan's role is not sort of a headline making, but it's consistent, very sober, but important. And I think the fabric is a good word that used to establish some sort of a network, and network is connected by those fabric. But I'd like to ask Funaba-san about this title. Do you think, I mean, we all know that Funaba-san has written far more larger number of books, and his book titled, Funaba-san's book title is always interesting, like Dome Hyoryu or Tsukaretsuretsu. I can't really translate that.
More.
But I think as an expert of the book title, how do you see that this book's title?
I think it's a great title. I think it's a great book, but title really matters. And I have one good friend of mine who just coined the word Japan's courteous power. Okay, courteous. So I think that people are trying to grope for, find some new way of definition about Japan's emerging influence. And I think that Mireya just found the right one. I was just told Mireya that she was invited by Seoul National University to give a lecture to that students at that university. So I'm wondering how they would respond to this Japan's quiet leadership, but she may have to conduct a balancing act. When I was a student at Harvard, the book I read was that Nye and Cohen's book, Power and Interdependence. And in that book, they argued that the nation's power simply does not sum up that its parts, that material wealth and numbers, but relationship. So I think that Japan has established or is establishing a new relationship among the nations which matter the most to Japan and elsewhere, particularly throughout that Indo-Pacific. And I think so that's perhaps a new influence that Japan is now acquiring, and Mireya actually, captured this new reality in a very much succinct way. 59% of ASEAN now are viewing Quad very favorably. This is a sea change compared to, say, 15 years, 17 years ago, when Quad 1.0 was just established. It met with a very strong resistance, suspicions, not only from the ASEAN countries, but from the Quad countries themselves. Okay, so it did not get off the ground. So I think that this quiet leadership is not only a good title, but it's a really dynamic strategic concept.
I fully agree. This is a strategic concept, and it is a reflection of the reality. So let me go into the main concept or the keyword of the book, the network power. So you are demonstrating that Japan is capable of creating a network power in this very turbulent time, and creating the, using all this fabric to connect different countries, and this connectivity is becoming as a resource for the Japan's diplomacy. However, the question I have is that if you are connecting with the like-minded countries, the friends and allies, that's not that difficult. When you try to connect with the hostile countries, countries like China, how does this network power will affect on the countries, let's put it bluntly, Japan-China relationship?
Yeah. Well, I think that here there's already a very important step, and that is that Japan was willing to negotiate a trade agreement with China, right? So you have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership where China is a member, and that's an agreement that wants to still build up the supply chain. So that concept remains very attractive to the region, because I think that it's well understood that by tapping on the complementarities of these countries, there's going to be economic gain. Now, what I think is that Japan is doing now is that, yes, I think it's important to send the signal to China that we can talk trade, something that the United States and China cannot really do. You have the phase one trade agreement between the United States and China that's not really about free trade, it's not really about supply chains. It was mostly a political exercise that resulted in managed trade outcomes, and that has never really had any impact. The RCEP is different, and also sends a message. It's not just how you interact with the competing powers, but how you do that in the context of the wider region. So again, I think that the rest of ASEAN looked positively to the fact that Japanese trade diplomacy was flexible to do this. Now, at the same time, Japan now is launching into this economic security arena, where I think it's going to become, there are going to be trade-offs. Because the more that Japan begins to follow or implement parallel export controls to what the United States is doing, China is responding. And when Japan issued this rule whereby 23 categories of production equipment for semiconductor are now subject to export controls last spring, then China issued this new rule of germanium and gallium now are also going to be subject to export control. So I think that's the real challenge for Japan, that at some point China is going to object, and China is doing a lot of things on its own. It's not just that, it's just responding. But I think it's going to be difficult for Japan to operate in these two different spheres when it talks about economic liberalization and when it talks about, well, actually, we don't want a lot of the technology to go your way. We're giving incentives to companies to diversify away from China. And, Beijing obviously objects to that. I think that, I have a new book project that I'm just about to launch, and, I think that one of the concepts for that book is going to be about emerging economic security coalitions. And then it begins to be that trust is very important, and that you have preferential technological cooperation and even perhaps investment and all kinds of arrangements with a subset of countries. And that might be what's required. But the more that Japan and others go that path, the harder it's going to be this all-out connectivity network power. And I see that as the next balancing act going forward.
So I think it's interesting that the concept of network power is, I think there are two levels or two different kinds of network power. Mm-hmm. One is the capability of networking, mm-hmm. and how to use network as a power. And I think the coalition of the economic security is using the network as a power, mm-hmm. to counter the threats. On the other hand, the creating this, all-out networks is the capability of networking. And mm-hmm. I think the terminology of the network power may have these two different categories. And I think Japan was initially in the former, which is the a capability of creating a network, but gradually, because of the changing environment, the network power becoming more like a using the network as the power to confront the challenges.
Yeah. No, I think that's excellent, and I think that's like the prologue to the Japanese edition or something. The conceptual development, and I do believe that Japan's building of the networks provides Japan with some line of defense to deal with pressure from China. China very much would like be part of the CPTPP. Had Japan not rescued the CPTPP, Japan would not have a card also to play with China as to whether if China were to embark on, very serious economic coercion against Japan, well, that basically renders moot the application to the CPTPP. So, networks do provide power, and networks do provide the ability to deal with rival competing actors.
So I would like to ask Funabashi-san, this network power is a new category of power. We have a lot of different kinds of power, the normative power. So how do you evaluate that? Is this really a power in your view? Does network really become as a power? And I think since in the context of the liberal international order, is networking should be a power or it shouldn't? I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, this is a very intriguing question, but first, let me say, perhaps network power has emerged as a kind of unintended consequences of collapsing that rule-based international order, WTO par excellence. There has emerged a vacuum, and for China to exploit. So to prevent China from exploiting this, the nations feel compelled to seek a new kind of power, and Japan has been spearheading. And I think it's we should give a lot of credit to Abe administration, which came up with a very effective economic statecraft and proactive one to counterbalance with China. So I think that's the reason why Japan has begun to be much more well regarded and more seriously as a player. So I think the network power is real power, and I think that's in this age of economic statecraft and geoeconomics, I think that power radiates and signifies even a more pronounced way, in my view.
Thank you very much. I think I agree that this concept like data free flow with trust, or the common platform which is introduced in the G7 Hiroshima summit communique, and I think there are growingly, Japan is taking a quiet leadership to build up this network and the platform, and that is creating certain power against this very turbulent time. And as Funabashi-san said, I think this is because of the fragmentation of the rule-based order. I think this is the way in which to maintain a sort of a smaller scale, not the universal pan-out rule-based order, but it's more like a minilateral, smaller scale, network-based, rule-based order. So I think your concept of network power can be translated into this minilateralism, or the way in which that the world is now fragmented, but needs to have some sort of a security zone or safety zone of the rule-based order. Is my understanding correct?
Yeah, no, I think that's very much right. And I believe that, there's a lot happening in the region, but we're moving past the hub and spoke alliance system. I mean, obviously, the commitments of an alliance are something that's, of course, incredibly powerful and makes an entire difference when countries face international crisis. But nevertheless, they're beyond the war threat. I think there are a number of issue areas where countries want to do more. And the fact that you begin to have these horizontal networks allowing issue-specific cooperation makes a difference. Now, we're witnessing a lot of unilateral initiatives. There are tons of bilaterals, trilaterals out there. Some of them will amount to nothing, and then you have to begin to discern from the real ones, the ones that will prevail, from others that may be more temporary. But there are some that have the potential to really change the dynamics, the rhythm of how things are conducted in the region. And the Camp David principles that were just agreed upon a few weeks back, if that really takes root, and indeed you do have now the United States, South Korea, and Japan with a more functional relationship, thinking about, I think that what's striking is how they are now coming to a shared reading of what the regional challenges and opportunities are, and this commitment to consult at times of international crisis. I mean, those are really meaningful developments. Now, one of the lessons from the book is that, of course, what happens domestically will ultimately shape the fate of these diplomatic endeavors and these new unilaterals. So, that trilateral, Japan, South Korea, US, will face the test of what's to come when there's a change of government in each of these countries. But already having that demonstration effect that, there's a lot that can be accomplished if you work together. And again, countries that would like to have, certainty, predictability, rules-based order in turbulent times, that carries a lot of weight. So I think that that's why, these mega trade agreements are making a difference, because at a time when you see economic nationalism proliferate, there's a desire to be under the umbrella of certain rules that can actually help provide that certainty for international businesses.
Right. Thank you very much. So let me just switch to the more recent and actual questions that is derived from your analysis on the Japanese diplomacy. The first one is which is the ongoing issue of the conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East. I mean, Japan, as you mentioned in your book, that Japan took a very sort of a quick decision to follow the G7 and to commit it to the condemning the Russia for the invasion in Ukraine and join the economic sanctions, unlike what during the Abe administration. But on the other hand, what's going to happen in the Middle East? Japan is standing out from the G7 network, and Japan was not a part of this six states declaration. Mm-hmm. So how do you see these switches, or let's say, I think the about the case in Russia is more like a network of Japan, being as a chair of the G7, while for the Middle East, that is something quite different. So how do you explain that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I understand that the United States and Japan are not always going to come to the same place when they're facing an international crisis, because they are operating in different areas of the world and because they have different equities or historical trajectories. So that's understood. Now, I think with the Ukraine crisis, it was really striking how swift was the Japanese response, how much Prime Minister Kishida broke from the precedent of what had been Russia policy under Prime Minister Abe, and how much Japan then began to coordinate with these G7 countries on sanctions and all in the same page. Now, with the Middle East, I think it's going to be harder. We're already beginning to see some of these differences in voting in the UN and in other arenas. And quite frankly, now, sitting here in this beautiful surrounding, it's hard to wrap your head around what may be coming, but already what has happened has been a brutal attack from Hamas, and now, of course, a lot of casualties of civilians in Gaza, and the potential that this could become a regional conflict. So we don't even know yet the full ramifications of this. Now, I do think that this will be perhaps something that, for the U.S.-Japan relationship, it's a difficult one. And what I would like to convey here is that I think that in the United States, this is being felt very, very intensely. Because 32 Americans lost their lives because there's a lot of connections between the Israeli and American societies. This is already playing big in the domestic politics and could have even further ramifications if it ends up dividing the Democratic base. That could actually even have consequences for next year. And I think it's going to be, the U.S. also now has to obviously handle a very, very difficult situation, and it's now dealing with crisis in many different theaters. And I imagine people here in the Indo-Pacific are thinking, we don't want the U.S. to lose sight of the pacing challenge of China. So all these things are going to be need to be sorted out. I hear when I'm in Tokyo that one element that Japan has that could be useful at some point in dealing with this situation is that Japan does have a communication channel with Iran. So how that is used might be of interest. But certainly I think that we should all be prepared to the fact that when it comes to how the approach to the Middle East crisis, that we might not have the US and Japan on the same page on every front. And that's not a prerequisite for a good functioning partnership alliance. There's going to be differences, but given that we just saw the opposite in Ukraine, we should be managing expectations that will not perhaps play out this time around.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Funabashi-san the same question. How do you see these differences of the approach to the G7 or the Western solidarities or standing on the same values and same values and norms? Do you think that Japan is standing out from the sort of a Western norms, or is this a Japanese conscious decision of playing it as an alternative?
Well, I think in case of Russia's invasion into Ukraine, Japan did not have any choice but to uphold the UN Charter and G7's solidarity because it's such a glaring violation of sovereignty, no question about it. But also at the same time, Japan had to consider that ramification of this invasion for East Asian geopolitical arena. Prime Minister Kishida said in London that today's Ukraine may be tomorrow's East Asia. So if we allow Russia to invade Ukraine and win, that would be very much a wrong signal, a lesson to us, particularly. It might embolden China to invade Taiwan. So we just cannot allow Putin to win. And that's a lesson that she is expected to learn. But in case of Middle East today will be Middle East tomorrow. So I think naturally Japan's perspectives and interests differ from those in case of Ukraine. Certainly we obliged to uphold that international norms and UN charters. So the Japanese government expressed its denunciation on Hamas's act also expressed that solidarity towards Israel's. But at the same time, I think that we have also have to be mindful of that the legacy ramifications of those Israel-Palestinian issues. And so we hope that Israel would not overreact, and Israel would uphold that humanitarian rule. And they are also required to respect that proportionality and necessity about their actions, including military one. So I think that, as Mireya said, that Japan should explore the ways to calm the situation and to prevent the further, inflammation of the situation. And Iran's role perhaps may be very much critical in that context. So, traditionally Japan's relationship with Iran has been very much steady, and in many instances that it have been different from that of the United States policy. And Japan's relationship with Saudi Arabia also has been very much cordial and long-standing and established one. I think we really should respect that one. So Japan actually has a very good interest and stakes and good reputation throughout the Middle East, including Palestinians. I think that's a diplomatic asset, and I think we should take advantage of that and harness that.
Thank you very much. I think this is, together with the concept of the network power, this relationship with Middle East and Iran in particular is the diplomatic asset. And I think this concept of the networking and the asset is somewhat, resonate. And I think this is something that to add on. There are, I still have a list of questions, but unfortunately the time is so limited, and we only have 8 minutes to go. So I'd like to take questions from the audience.
Okay. Well, I would say this event has been anything but quiet, so I think that you're already promoting the book to begin with. Just very briefly, on the foreign worker issue, as I was doing the research for that chapter in the book, couple of things struck me, but one is the centrality of the subnational governments, and those are the ones that are closer to the foreign workers, and I think that they have led the way in thinking about the integration supports that are required for that. So what I would like is for the national government to be learning from the experience of those local governments and then take it to the next level. As much as I'm encouraged to see that Japan now explicitly acknowledges the need for manual workers, has made a visa program for that, I think that this is just the beginning of what could become a really fundamental national conversation about whether that opens or not the possibility for immigration later on. Because we have other countries who have only invited foreign workers, and that also then creates problems of its own. So again, you're in the middle of a transition, and what's the end point? I don't think that's been sufficiently discussed, and I think that that's going to become more important to the national conversation going forward. On Japan and South Asia, I think that's a great question, and I imagine, and I don't know the situation in Bangladesh, I have to confess, but I can see that perhaps Japan has not been as present as China has, and I think that, it is true that Japan has, they compare the size of the Chinese economy to the Japanese economy and the difficulties there, but also, extrapolating from other cases, not the one from Bangladesh, because I know the situation. I think it's important to realize that, yes, there's a stiff competition between Japan and China In infrastructure, for example, in Indonesia, the loss to China's bid for some of the rail projects, that was very shocking, I think, to Japan. That was one of the incentives why Japan began to articulate more coherently its quality for its partnership for quality infrastructure. And at the end of the day, it's also important to see, even though China may be nominally putting more, at the end of the day, we're seeing that in some cases it doesn't really deliver, and that creates also a lot of dissatisfaction from the counterparts. So again, the fact that China is loud and not quiet does not necessarily always mean effective. And on the economic security and the U.S., I think that this is a fundamental question. And Jake Sullivan came to Brookings to give the speech on what is the vision for foreign economic strategy of the Biden administration. As he himself said it, it's quite remarkable that the National Security Advisor is the one laying out the economic strategy. That, I think, even if the speech has stopped there, you already got a full, transformational description of where we are. Now, I know that the U.S. has now adopted the de-risking narrative. I'm not convinced that they're practicing de-risking. I feel that there's going to be more decoupling. And one of the reasons I say this is that the Trump-era tariffs that cover a very substantial range of bilateral trade, both China and the U.S. imposed on one another, they're still there. So that already is different from how other countries are practicing de-risking. And then when it comes to export controls, I'm not sure, again, that the very disciplined small yard high fence is going to remain, because I think that what they have identified is force multiplying technologies. That's how they describe them, which means that these technologies are huge for a future, present and future competitiveness and military applications. So that doesn't seem to me like you're really tinkering on the margins. That's big. And I don't know I have not heard how are you going to begin to delist items if they're no longer in the technological edge? What I'm saying is that I think that the list is growing only in one direction, which is higher, and not periodically try to bring it down. So as the technological frontier moves, I imagine that we're going to be seeing more restrictions, and that just happened last week when there was, on the anniversary of October 7th, a new rule that tries to cut on the loopholes. But as you do that, you grow the areas that are restricted, and you ask your allies to do more with you. So I think at the end of the day, both because of what China is doing, and China is doing plenty with national security restrictions, the surveillance state, the digital firewall, China is doing a lot. I think that that creates so much uncertainty that I think that international business are rethinking their approach to China and to the US, and this will bring a further fragmentation of some supply chains, certainly in the high frontier technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for concise response. Well, with that, we are still, the 4 minutes over, but I think we are almost on time. And well, thank you very much for being a very unquiet audience. And thank you very much for Mireya and Funabashi-san for a very exciting discussion. I think this discussion has helped you to understand more deeper on this book. And I also thank Mireya for completing this book, and I congratulate you. So please join me in congratulating her.